I have not been here for 100 years. It doesn't even feel like that. But hopefully after I talk a little bit today, you'll see that some folks here 100 years ago were making observations of birds, the true charismatic fauna of Denali. And that some of their observations are very useful for looking at some apparent changes in the avifauna here. I'd like to thank the Central Alaska Network for providing most of the funding these days for our ongoing bird monitoring work in Denali, and also the Alaska Bird Observatory for partnering with us on a lot of our songbird work here. Also, a whole suite of photographers who provided some of the photos that you'll see today, which make this talk much more beautiful than it would be if I had to show my photos of songbirds. So birds make up a large proportion of the vertebrate species here in Denali. What I think is really interesting about birds is just the diversity of the species that are here. We have an amazing group of resident species that show incredible resilience at very cold temperatures, very adaptable to living in this extreme climate, such as the common redpoll on the left there and the black-capped chickadee. And in spring, these hardy residents are joined by these magnificent long-distance migrants, such as the Arctic tern and the long-tailed jaeger. And I think it's very exciting to work in a place for so long where you get to study some of these amazing birds along with some of these rather dull, large, lumbering mammals. Oh, this is on tape, isn't it? So when I was thinking about what I should talk about today, there were a lot of things I thought would be interesting, with the theme of this conference being crossing boundaries, and I study migratory birds. But one of the things I thought would be cool is just looking at some of the differences of some of the bird populations or observations we see today compared with what people saw nearly 100 years ago. And it was really spurred on by this quote by Adolph Murray. Since Mount McKinley National Park has been set aside as an area to be left in natural condition, the accumulation of many observations will in time afford a valuable faunal history. So I'd like you to keep that in mind today as we walk through this. Real quickly, I just want to walk through some of the history of ornithological observations here. Names that we've all heard before: Charles Sheldon, Joseph Dixon, George Wright, Olaus Murie, and Adolph Murie. All people who seem to be somewhat fascinated with large mammals, but also spend a considerable amount of time making observations on birds. Sheldon published the first list of birds from this region in the Auk, one of the most prestigious ornithological journals still today. Olaus Murie was here in the early 20s to study caribou. His most famous finding here in Denali was the first documented nest of a wandering tattler in North America. He was followed up in 1926 and 1932 by Joseph Dixon and George Wright, who was his field assistant in 1926. Perhaps the most famous discovery that those fellows make was the first documentation of a nesting pair of surf birds. Again, George Wright made this observation. Dixon actually published on it, but nonetheless. And perhaps Dixon is most well known for his monumental work of birds and mammals in Mount McKinley National Park, which was part of the fauna series. And it's actually Dixon's observations that I make a lot of comparisons with these days, because he was an extremely good observer, took immaculate field notes. And then, of course, we've all heard of Adolph Murie. Adolph Murie spent a lot of time in the park, made a lot of observations of birds, but perhaps most famous, at least in the ornithological world, for finding the first nesting pair of Arctic warblers in North America. Now, who can say that wolf pups are cuter than that little face? I just don't get this. And of course, Murie followed up in 1963 with his book, Birds of Mount McKinley. So, there was a lot of work done here over the years by some very famous biologists that give us, contemporary biologists, some baseline information to look at some changes. Now, we have a lot of ongoing bird monitoring programs here in Denali, and I'm not going to mention all of them, but we're very lucky because we cover a lot of species and a lot of time. Some of these are beginning to be these legacy data sets, as Brad Griffith mentioned yesterday, how important they are for looking at change over time. Today I'm going to focus on just one, because what I'm going to talk about are just a few examples of some of the change we've seen here. And we're going to look at some of the comparisons that we have seen between our National Breeding Bird Survey, just from 2001 to present, and then look at some work done with the trumpeter swan census. So we're going to use data from there to compare with some of these historic observations. So, just to give you an idea of where this work occurred, most of the work from 1922 to 1962 occurred within the boundary of this red dashed line. So basically the northern part of the old Mount McKinley National Park. Currently, we do a lot of work in the same area. These little red squares indicate some of our mini grids that some other folks have talked about earlier. These are our two breeding bird survey routes, 50 points located a half a mile apart right along the park road. And of course, I've been here for about 20 years. Lots of people have been here longer than I have, and lots of observations of birds right along the Denali Park Road. So kind of the similar area for most of what I'll talk about today. So there's two species I want to talk about changes in, apparent changes. The first is the orange-crowned warbler. And this is an apparent change in the abundance of this species. This is a pretty snappy little bird. It's relatively easy to identify by the lack of predominant field marks. It's a pretty, what people would say, drab, olive-colored bird. This is a gorgeous bird with a very characteristic call. However, was it always very common here? Is it common here today? Well, Dixon said our experience both in 1926 and 1932 leads us to believe that the orange-crowned warbler, which Wright saw, was merely a late migrant passing through the McKinley region. Today, it's a little different. The other day I said, imagine walking up the Savage River and never hearing an orange-crowned warbler, and most people said, so? Well, you know, it would be real different. Of course, if we were here in the Cretaceous period, we might hear something incredibly different, as we found this morning. But this is just the raw data from our breeding bird censuses, surveys. This is just the number of detections of this species from 2000 to 2006 every year on our Savage route and our Toklat route. And there's differences among years and differences between the routes. But notice, we see almost 100 of these individuals almost every year. Keep in mind, Wright never saw one. So what's going on here? Orange-crowned warblers are distributed throughout Alaska, interior Alaska, and since the late 1960s, when the Breeding Bird Survey was incorporated, there hasn't been any substantial change in their population. What's going on? I don't know, but I gotta get that train. No, I don't know what's gone on. We could talk about this sometime. We could make speculations, but we won't do that now. The other species I want to talk about apparent changes is in the whimbrel, and this is an apparent change in the distribution of this species. Now the whimbrel is, again, a very easy bird to identify. It's a very large shorebird. It has a very large decurved bill and a very characteristic call. Now Dixon said whimbrels are, or they used to be called Hudsonian godwit, by the way, they're found breeding in fair numbers on wet tundra areas in the higher passes of Mount McKinley regions between Savage River and Copper Mountain. And continued on in 1932, curlews were found in about the same numbers and at the same place that they were found in 1926. These birds occur commonly and are regular breeders in the Mount McKinley region. Murray followed in 1963. It is a rather conspicuous nesting bird in the low rolling open tundra among sedge hummocks. He continued that along the road it is often seen between the Savage and Sanctuary rivers, and it has been seen quite often between East Fork and Toklat rivers, and from the Muldrow Glacier to Wonder Lake. He saw it quite often. Bruce Lee, who's a long-term resident here and a shuttle bus and a tour bus driver, told me that whimbrels were a common sighting when he first started driving the park road in the mid-1970s. Well, today it's a little different story. Again, this is just our simple breeding bird data. Number of whimbrels seen here on the Toklat and the Savage routes, and you can see we very rarely see whimbrels on these two surveys. We have a little bit more breeding bird survey data that I'm showing in some of these slides, actually back to 1982 in some cases. And there is some indication here, here's the number of detections, there is some indication that in the early 80s, or 1980s through the late 80s, that whimbrels were seen more commonly along the park road, at least on the Toklat breeding bird survey route. So what's going on? Well, I don't know. But we know that today they're rarely seen within a quarter mile of the park road, and they're more likely to be encountered greater than a quarter mile off the park road. This suggests that there could be some avoidance of the park road. It's a much busier road today than it was when Muriel was here. Or perhaps a shift in distribution, or a change in abundance. However, we have no data on this species to determine population trends, its abundance in this park, or its distribution. Just briefly mention these are just two examples of some pretty large-scale changes, apparent changes. But there's lots of other species where we have seen either a decrease in abundance or a change in their distribution, including the species listed here. There's also a suite of species where we've seen either a apparent increase in abundance or a change in the distribution. So there's a lot of things happening. It's not a static landscape, as we know. Now, apparent change is a very gray area. It's not what managers want to base their management decisions on. So in the last part of my talk, I want to briefly mention something that makes managers very happy. Documented change, and what you need to actually have documented change. And for that, I'm going to talk about changes in the trumpeter swans here in Denali. Historically, trumpeter swans were not mentioned by Sheldon, Dixon, or Murie, all the way up even until the early 1960s. Now, someone pointed out to me earlier today, well, of course they didn't see them. They never went to the northwest corner of this park. But trumpeter swans migrate through this part of the park in spring and in fall. But none of these guys mention them. Well, why? Well, when the Fish and Wildlife Service did their first statewide trumpeter swan survey, this is the number of swan observations that they made in the Minchumina Basin in the northwest corner of Denali. Here they are. Same map. Oh, and I should tell you that Wonder Lake is over in here, Cantichina Hills. So this is in the far northwest corner of this park preserve. Last year, this is how many swans were in that area. Documented change, going from less than 100 adults in the early 70s to more than 700 adults now, corresponding very nicely with the change in trumpeter swan numbers throughout the state. Oh, the light is red. I'm almost done. The reason that we can look at this with such confidence is the Fish and Wildlife Service conducts standardized, repeatable surveys. So it allows us not to just say it's apparent change, but it's actual change. That's very important when you're managing a park and a preserve. So in conclusions, historic bird observations are valuable for identifying apparent changes, for building hypotheses to explore the cause of change, and for planning future studies. Documenting change in the abundance and distribution of birds requires well-developed standardized data collection and analytical procedures and a robust sampling design. Thankfully, the current long-term monitoring programs for birds in the Central Alaska Network incorporate these, and that will allow us to look at detection of birds and their distribution and abundance over time and exploring how they respond to changes in the landscape. Thank you.